Montana Territory, June 1883. The sun blazed down over the dusty clapboard church on the edge of Dry Creek, and Della Fairchild stood frozen beneath its faded white steeple, her lace veil trembling in the wind. Her hands, still clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers, were slick with sweat. Faces stared up from wooden pews, their mouths tight with pity, some with curiosity. But her eyes were locked on the man who had just stepped back from the altar. Clayton Rourke, his jaw clenched, his hat in his hands. "I can't marry you," he said, his voice low and dull in the dead silence. "I thought I could, but I can't. I'm sorry." He turned and walked straight out the side door, boots thudding across the plank floor. The Reverend's mouth hung open. Della did not move. A murmur rolled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. At the very back row, seated alone with his hat tipped low, a cowboy stood. He was tall and lean, with sunburned cheeks and a quiet steadiness in his eyes. Without a word, he made his way down the aisle. The crowd parted instinctively. His boots were scuffed, his shirt dusted with trail dirt, and a faint scar ran along his jaw. He stopped beside Della, who still stared at the empty door as if her breath had gone with it. "You all right, miss?" he asked softly. Della blinked. She turned slowly, as if waking from a bad dream. Her voice cracked, barely there. I do not know." The cowboy looked to the Reverend, then the gathering crowd, then back to Della. "You do not have to stand here alone," he said. "Not today." She stared at him, a stranger and yet not unfamiliar. She remembered seeing him around town once or twice, always quiet, always apart. He had a horse with a silver streak on its nose. She remembered that, too. "I'm Josiah Hart," he said gently. "I was just sitting in the back, watching. Thought I'd step in before too many folks started talking." She swallowed hard. "They already are." He offered his arm, not demanding, just steady. "Let's get you out of here." Della hesitated, then laid her hand on his arm. It felt strong, warm. He led her down the aisle, past the stunned Reverend, past the gaping townsfolk, and out into the sunlight. They walked in silence for a stretch, the wind tugging at her veil until she yanked it off and tossed it aside. Her white dress dragged in the dirt as they moved toward the hitching post. "I do not know why he did it," she said finally, voice hollow. "He gave no warning. We were supposed to leave for Helena after the ceremony. He said he wanted a family, said he loved me." Josiah untied his horse and glanced at her. "Some men say things they do not mean. Others mean things they do not say. Either way, it hurts." She looked up at him then, her eyes glassy. "Why did you come up there?" He hesitated, then said, "Because no one should be left to stand alone when the world falls out from under them." Della's throat tightened. She turned her face away, hiding the tears that slipped free. "I live out near Broken Ridge," he said after a moment. "If you need a place to breathe for a while, it is quiet out there, no one asking questions." She wiped her cheek with the back of her hand. "You do not even know me." "I do not need to," he said simply. "Not to offer something kind." She studied him. "And what do you want in return?" "Nothing," he said. "Just figured you could use a clean place to rest, a roof for the night. After that, you can do whatever suits you." Della looked back toward the church. People were spilling out now, some concerned, others pretending not to watch. Her father would be furious. Her older sister would say she should have seen it coming. And Clayton. He was probably halfway out of town by now. She turned back to Josiah. "All right, just for the night." He helped her up onto his horse, then swung up behind her. They rode out, the town shrinking behind them. By the time they reached his land, the sun was falling low behind the hills. His house was a small, sturdy cabin built near a creek, with a barn not far off and a garden that showed signs of care. He dismounted and helped her down, his touch respectful. Inside, it was clean and simple. A table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a narrow bed in the corner, and a second cot folded nearby. "You can take the bed," he said. "I will set up the cot." "You do not have to do that, I know." She stood awkwardly near the door, unsure of what to do with her hands. Her wedding dress felt like a joke now. "I have an old dress my sister left behind a few years ago," he said. "Might fit you better than that." He handed her the faded blue fabric and stepped outside to give her privacy. When he came back, she was sitting at the table, her hair unpinned and falling down her back. The dress was a bit loose but clean. She looked tired but calmer. He handed her a cup of coffee. She accepted it with both hands. They ate in silence. Afterward, she stood and walked to the door, staring out into the dusk. "I do not know what comes next," she said quietly. "You do not have to know yet." She turned to him. "Why are you being so kind to me?" He met her gaze, his voice steady. "Because I have been alone too. And I know what it feels like when someone decides you are not worth staying for." She watched him, something softening in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a small nod. "You are welcome here, as long as you need." That night she lay in the bed staring at the ceiling. The wind rustled outside. She could hear the faint creak of the cot as he turned over once, then went still. And for the first time that day, she did not feel alone. The morning came slow, pale light filtering through the chinked logs of the cabin wall. Della sat up, the borrowed dress wrinkled from sleep, her hair tangled from tossing through the night. The air held that cool stillness before the heat rose, and she could hear water running somewhere nearby, a creek maybe, or a spring. She found Josiah at the chopping block behind the barn, sleeves rolled up, striking clean through a split of pine. He didn't look up when she stepped down from the porch. "You hungry?" he asked, setting another log upright. "I can cook," she said. "Least I can do," he paused, glanced over. "There's cornmeal and beans inside. Coffee too, if you don't mind day-old grounds." She headed back toward the house, the weight in her chest still present but not as sharp. Inside, she found a kettle, a dented tin of salt, and a cast iron pan already seasoned with years of use. She worked quietly, hands moving with the comfort of habit. She didn't think about the dress she'd sewn for a wedding that never happened. She didn't think about the man who'd walked away from her without flinching. Josiah came in just as she set the pan on the stove. He wiped his hands on a rag and stood near the door, not quite entering all the way. "I'll fetch the well bucket," he said. "Already did," she replied. "Water's heating," he nodded once. "Appreciate it." They sat at the table, both chewing in silence. Della took small bites, her stomach still unsure of itself. Josiah ate like a man used to quiet meals, not rushed but without lingering. Afterward, she washed the plates and set them to dry on a folded cloth near the hearth. Josiah stood to put his hat on, creased at the crown, darkened at the brim. "I need to check the pasture fence," he said. "Storm last week knocked a few rails loose." She looked toward the door, then back at him. "Can I come with you?" He studied her, then gave a small nod. "If you don't mind walking some." "I don't." They crossed the field behind the barn where tall grass brushed against Della's skirt. The fence ran along the slope above a cottonwood grove, rough-hewn posts leaning where the ground had softened from rain. Josiah carried a hammer tucked through his belt and a coil of wire over one shoulder. "Was this your land to start with?" she asked as they reached the first fallen rail. "No," he said. "Belonged to my uncle. He passed near 5 years ago. Left it to me since he never married." She handed him a wedge of wood he dropped. "You close with him?" Josiah knelt, wedging the board back in place. "Not until the end. I came out west after the war, worked cattle near Deer Lodge, then freighted goods up from Gallatin. He found me in town one winter, offered me a bed if I'd help him through the cold. That was the first time someone wanted me around without a price." Della leaned on the post, the rough grain catching her palm. "My mother died when I was 10. My father remarried within the year. His new wife didn't much like children who weren't hers." He looked up at her, hands still on the wire. "You get along with your sister." She always had a way of making things look easy. I envied that. She paused. "She told me once I was too soft for life out here. That I'd end up broken." Josiah stood and tested the rail with his boot. "You don't strike me as soft." "I've been told worse." They kept working the fence, the rhythm of labor easing the weight between them. By the time they reached the final post, the sun was high and sweat trickled down Della's neck. She wiped her face with her sleeve, then pushed her hair back, not caring how it looked. You've done this before, Josiah said. Not fences, she said, but plenty of days in the field. I used to help our neighbor mend his barn after spring storms. He was nearly blind but stubborn as a mule. Josiah smiled faintly. Sounds familiar. They walked back, the slope gentle beneath their feet. As they neared the cabin, a rider crested the far ridge, a man in a dark coat, his horse moving at a steady trot. Della tensed, fingers curling at her side. Josiah noticed. Someone you know, she squinted. That's Sheriff Vickers. The man approached, tipping his hat as he reined in. Hart, he said. Ma'am, Josiah gave a nod. Sheriff. Vickers looked between them, his expression unreadable. Town's in a stir. Clayton Rourke left a note at the boarding house. Said he's heading south, no plans to return. Della said nothing. The sheriff cleared his throat. Folks are talkin', just thought you should know. Josiah stepped forward slightly. She's staying here for now, under my roof, no concern to anyone else. Vickers studied them, then gave a short nod. Long as she's safe, that's all I care about. He tipped his hat again, then turned and rode off. Once the dust settled, Della exhaled slowly. I didn't expect him to come all the way out here. Word travels fast when folks don't have enough to do, Josiah said. She looked at him, her voice low. Do you mind that I'm here? That people will talk, he met her eyes, something steady in his gaze. Let them, I know why you're here. She watched him a moment, then turned toward the cabin. I should see about supper. Josiah followed her in, the door swinging shut behind them. Outside, the wind picked up through the grass, bending it in slow waves across the land. Inside, 2 chairs stood close at the table, and a kettle began to hiss on the stove. By late June, the heat grew thick enough to slow even the bees, their hum heavy around the porch rafters. Della stood outside with her skirt gathered in one hand, her other wrist resting against her hip as she watched Josiah finish hitching a mule to the small cart. A breeze stirred the cottonwoods along the creek, but it did little to cut through the warmth. I'd like to ride into town with you, she said. Josiah paused, then adjusted the strap across the mule's flank. You sure you want to be seen there again? Folks haven't grown quieter. She stepped off the porch, her shoes sinking slightly in the warm dirt. I'm not hiding. Not from them. Her voice was even, but her eyes held a new steadiness, like a door had shut behind her and she didn't intend to look back through it. He gave a short nod and helped her into the cart. The mule plodded forward, hooves kicking up small clouds along the road that wound between low hills and sun-bleached grass. They passed a patch of prairie sage, its silver leaves trembling, and Della reached down to crush a piece between her fingers. The scent clung to her skin. You always live alone? She asked, not looking at him. He tightened the reins with one hand. For a long while. She waited, then turned toward him. You ever think about changing that? Josiah didn't answer right away. I used to, thought maybe I'd find someone who wanted the same quiet life. But I spent more time moving than staying. It gets harder to ask someone to follow when you're not sure where you're going. She considered that, fingers resting on the edge of the cart. I never meant to leave Dry Creek. I thought that town was enough. You still want it to be. Della looked out over the rise, where the roofs of the town were just beginning to show. I want something of my own choosing. Whatever that ends up being. The cart rolled into the main street just as the midday bell from the schoolhouse rang once. Heads turned. A few women standing near the mercantile lowered their voices but didn't stop watching. Josiah tied off the reins outside the smithy. Della stepped down without hesitation, brushing dust from her skirt. I'll meet you in the store, she said. He gave her a quiet look. You don't need to go in alone, she met his gaze. I do. She pushed through the door of the general store. The bell overhead rang, sharp and sudden. Mr. Halperin glanced up from behind the counter, his mustache twitching slightly. Afternoon, Miss Fairchild. She moved toward the shelves. Afternoon. The room was still for a beat too long. Then a girl near the bolts of muslin returned to her mother's side and a low murmur picked back up. Della kept her chin level and reached for a tin of baking powder. Her hands didn't shake. When she stepped back outside, Josiah was leaning against the cart, a small cloth bundle in hand. Got your tea, he said simply. She tucked the parcel into her basket. Thank you. They passed by the dressmaker's on the way out. The window displayed a new bodice trimmed in pale green, finer than anything Della had ever owned. She stopped a moment, looking but not moving closer. Josiah's voice came low beside her. You ever sew for others? I used to a little. Mostly mending, I never had time for anything fancier. He nodded once. You've got the hands for it. Della looked over. What do you mean, deliberate, careful, like you're always choosing what to hold and what to let go? Her mouth parted slightly, but she didn't reply. They rode back in silence, the sun dipping lower behind them. That evening, Josiah sat whittling on the step while Della shelled peas by the fire. The light inside the cabin turned golden, softening the hard lines of the wood. She watched him for a moment, then said, You speak like someone who's been carrying things a long while. He didn't lift his eyes. Most men do, they just don't say it plain. You lost someone. He turned the small piece of wood in his palm, the knife working with quiet precision. My brother. He was younger, didn't come back from the Shenandoah Valley. I kept riding west because standing still meant thinking too long. Della set the bowl aside and crossed to the doorway, her arms folded loosely. You don't talk much about yourself. I don't think most things need telling unless someone's ready to hear them. She stepped outside, her shoulder brushing his as she sat beside him. The scent of pine smoke drifted from the stove chimney. I'm ready, she said. He looked at her then, fully. The silence between them shifted, less like distance and more like understanding. You ever think about staying? She asked. Josiah didn't answer right away. His voice was softer when it came. I do now. The last of the light settled on the hills, and the land fell quiet in that way it did only when the day had said everything it needed to. Behind them, the fire crackled low, the bowl of peas forgotten. Neither of them moved. The clouds over Broken Ridge turned low and violet, the kind that held off rain but made the air feel close. Della stood at the edge of Josiah's garden, a basket hooked in the crook of her arm, brushing dirt from a cluster of dug potatoes. The hem of her dress bore the dark smudges of kneeling, and her fingers were lined with soil. She didn't mind. The work steadied her, gave shape to the days that had begun to string together like pearls on a thread, quiet, deliberate, and strangely whole. Josiah was mending tack beneath the lean-to beside the barn, sleeves pushed to his elbows, his forearms marked with the faint streaks of leather dye. The rasp of his knife smoothing a stirrup strap filled the air between them. Della watched him for a moment, then reached for a gourd to place into the basket. I was thinking, she said, her voice carrying across the short stretch between them. That room off the side of the cabin, it could be fixed into a proper sewing corner. Josiah paused, looked up, and stood to his full height. You planning to take in work? She nodded. There's a woman east of town, Mrs. Colby. She's got 3 girls and says she's drowning in hems and torn cuffs. Said she'd pay fair if I could help. He stepped closer, wiping his hands on a rag. You want me to set a table in there, if you don't mind. She brushed a lock of hair from her brow. It would be good to earn something of my own. You're welcome here, no matter what you earn. I know, she said, voice softer now, but I'd still like it. Josiah gave a quiet sound of agreement, then reached into the basket to pick up a gourd. He turned it in his hands, thumb running along its curve. You've got an eye for what's worth keeping. She smiled faintly. I've had enough of losing things. That night, she sat by the hearth with needle and thread, stitching a tear in one of Josiah's shirts. The fire cast long shadows, and outside, the coyotes called to each other across the ridge. Josiah read from a worn volume resting open on his knee, his voice low and steady, the words not meant to impress but to share. When he paused, she looked up. You always read aloud, only when someone's listening. She folded the shirt and set it aside. My mother used to hum when she sewed, nothing with words, just the sound to fill the room. What did she make? Mostly mending, like me. But once she sewed a christening gown from a length of cotton she bartered off a peddler, said it was for the child I'd have one day. Her fingers pressed against her skirt. It burned with the rest of the house. Josiah's gaze didn't shift away. "What happened?" Stove caught while we were out tending a neighbor's birth. "I was 17. We came back to nothing but smoke and a foundation." He didn't offer sympathy, just held her eyes until she nodded once, as if to say she'd said enough. The next morning, she found him in the side room, clearing out the crates and broken tools that had collected over time. He glanced at her over his shoulder. "I'll cut a new board for the window. Let in more light." She stepped in beside him. "Thank you." They worked side by side without speaking much, but it wasn't silence in the way it had been weeks ago. Now it was full, like a language they both understood. Later, as she pressed open the shutters, the sun lit her face in a way that made Josiah stop mid-step. Her hands were smudged, her hair pinned without care, and her apron bore a streak of dried flour from breakfast. "You look like you belong here," he said. She turned to him, eyes searching his. "Do you want me to?" He stepped closer, slow and certain. "Not just today." "Every day," her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I never thought I'd want to start again, not like this." "Neither did I," he said, "but I've come to believe that some things don't require planning. Just the right person standing beside you when the trail turns." Her hand reached for his, fingers threading with quiet surety. When he kissed her, it was not quick or urgent, but deep and certain, the kind of kiss that came not from wanting, but from knowing. The fire crackled behind them. Outside, the wind carried the scent of sage and earth. They stood there until the light shifted, holding to each other not like a question, but like an answer finally found. By the turn of July, the days stretched long as wagon tracks and the nights cooled just enough to sleep with the windows open. The room Josiah cleared had taken to its new purpose clean, with a wide table Josiah built from pine planks and a shelf where Della kept her needles, chalk, and cloth. Word had reached the scattered homes east of the ridge that a quiet woman with steady hands was sewing again, and she'd already finished 2 shirts for Mrs. Colby's eldest, and a new apron for a widowed ranch cookover near Dry Butte. Della stood barefoot at the edge of the woodline behind the house, holding a bundle of damp linens. The washing was done, and her arms ached pleasantly from wringing. Across the yard, Josiah was trimming the edge of the corn rows, his hat low, the muscles in his back shifting beneath his shirt as he worked. There was a rhythm to their days now, one that needed no speaking. But not everything had settled. That evening, she poured water into the basin and splashed her face, the sunburn fading from her cheeks. Josiah leaned against the porch rail, watching her with quiet interest but not pressing her to talk. She dried her hands on her apron and joined him, easing down onto the bench. "You planning to keep the land?" she asked. He looked out toward the sloped pasture. "I thought about selling it once, figured I'd gone as far west as I could, but now—" He trailed off. Della waited. "I can't picture leaving it anymore," he finished. She nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about what it means to stay, not just in one place but with one person. It's different than I thought it would be." "In what way?" "It's quieter," she said. "But it holds more." Her eyes were steady on him. "I never saw myself here on someone's land, under someone's roof, unless I gave everything up to be there. But I haven't given anything up." "You've built something instead," he said. "So have I." They sat until the sun dropped behind the hills, the air turning lavender and still. Inside, the stew she'd started earlier filled the little cabin with thyme and onion. She rose first, brushing her hand along his shoulder as she passed. "Come eat," she said. Josiah followed her in, and they ate at the table with spoons that had lost their shine but not their use. After she reached for his empty bowl, "I'll do that," he said. She looked down at the bowl, then at him. "I like doing it." He stood, crossed the small room, and lifted her chin lightly with his fingers. "You don't have to carry things by yourself." "I know," she whispered. "But sometimes I still want to." His mouth touched hers then, slow and sure, and when she leaned into him, it wasn't with hesitation, but with the full weight of a woman who had chosen this moment with her whole heart. That night, she didn't sleep on the far side of the bed. She settled against him, her hand curled beneath his collarbone, his arm around her waist. Outside, the wind stirred the pine boughs. Inside, there was nothing left to run from. By the time the first frost came, they had built a new pen for the goats and added a second table beneath the window in her sewing room for larger orders. Della had taken to wearing a slate blue dress she made herself, with a row of modest buttons and sleeves rolled just past the elbow. Josiah had added her name to the land record at the county office when he went in for nails and salt. They were married in October, just the two of them and the reverend from Twin Cotton, under the cottonwood tree that still held a few gold leaves. Josiah carved their initials into the trunk after, and Della traced them once with her finger before turning to him with a smile that said they'd made something no one could unmake. They hosted a supper the next week, and neighbors came with pies and bannock bread and jars of plum preserves. Mrs. Colby brought her girls, and even Sheriff Vickers stayed until dusk, sipping coffee with Josiah on the porch while Della and the women talked inside. No one mentioned the church in Dry Creek or the man who had left her standing at its altar. That belonged to another life, when she had no need to revisit. In spring, Josiah built a cradle from leftover lumber, sanding every slat until it gleamed. Della lined it with muslin stitched in tiny stars. The baby came in May, a daughter with eyes the color of creekstone and a cry that filled the cabin with life. Her name was Clara. They grew together, the three of them, bound not by fortune or chance but by the choosing of each day. There were hard years of coarse drought, a broken axle, a winter that froze the well, but never again did either of them face a sorrow alone. Josiah still read aloud some nights, and Della still hummed when she sewed. And when the wind carried the sound of coyotes or the creek overflowed after a heavy rain, they simply held tighter to one another and waited for the stillness to return. Their love was not loud, not marked by grand gestures or declarations. It was in the way he left coffee warming for her each morning and how she mended his shirts before the seams could wear through. It was in the way they laughed quietly over the same stories, how they danced in the kitchen when no one was looking. It was in how they stayed. And in the end, that was everything.